Alright, so, brief little disclaimer here. This video is half satirical and half serious. It's exaggerated in parts for comedic effect, and at any point where it feels like I'm being overly negative is probably being portrayed in a moderately aggressive fashion is, again, probably for the sake of comedy. Originally, Topography was going to be his own little snippet in the soon-to-be-made video about how scuffed the new player experience is in this game, but once I realized how much of an absolute train wreck parts of this actually are, this deserves its own showcase, because no one has talked about this in like 2 years, and Wargaming also hasn't cared about it in that span of time either. No one's even really looked at it, again, in the past 2 years. Outside of the Russian server, where, I'm not making this up, for a speedrunning competition, which granted was a cool idea, but still, we're gonna absolutely rip it to shreds, and then try and build something back up better than it was before with the pieces that we have. Because, again, if we only rant about it and talk about the negative stuff and propose nothing good, we're not going to get anywhere. So let's start with the why. Like, a brief intro to this might be helpful.
Remember how often you were sent to your garage too quickly just because you chose the wrong route? Or you found yourself caught in a crossfire after taking a poor position? All this affects your survivability, combat effectiveness, and overall statistics. The Topography mode was created to prevent such things from frequently happening.
Now, on paper, this is great. Tell people what's good and bad, and let them know where it's dangerous to drive. No. A common theme throughout all of these scenarios here is that there is no real regard for the player actually staying safe. What you're gonna find out really quickly is that Wargaming's positioning is incredibly outdated, and does a very poor job at telling players to flank. Not that their maps make it easy in the first place. However, these scenarios largely make players think they can do three very, very dangerous things. One is go to specific places depending on tank type, and only depending on tank type, and encounter the same things when they're there every time. Number two is they think they can win any fight on their own, even if it's against two heavy tanks and a medium tank or similar. And three is reinforce the idea to fight things head on, no matter what it is. And there's a lot of these situations where you're shooting at a tank that's like fully hull down that you would never be able to kill in any moderately realistic situation, and you would be losing that trade every single time. But not here. Temporarily ignoring the less than stellar mechanics these enemy vehicles have, the situations themselves aren't great in terms of how combat works. For every simulation, or scenario, as I'm going to call them both throughout this video, they give you only 2 tank types and only 1 scenario for each class per spawn. This already creates a huge issue on a couple of maps where a situation is only presented as possible from one spawn and not the other. Completely ignoring the fact there's nothing on positions for light tanks or tank destroyers, these situations just outright detect vehicles for you and already let you know where you'll find them on the minimap. Which isn't the worst thing in the world, but you're not gonna have this happen in real games pretty much at all. The bots do not move, ever, at all, besides their turret. And they spawn in the exact same locations every single time. A player will know exactly what is going to happen by the 4th or 5th one of these things. I understand they need to make the easier situations easier, but all the medium tanks fire HE. Every single tank has 1mm of hull armor, everywhere, and the T-34 is using the 76mm gun, which nobody ever uses, and should use the 57mm instead, as it would also display how most medium tanks work, which is lower damage than heavy tanks, but higher rate of fire, and ultimately probably more DPM. The T-14 is also a very poor choice of tank for this, as it's a premium the players would likely never play again after this. And it's not even a good tank in the first place. Consider the T1 Heavy instead, as it's essentially the same gun, and a player will actually, probably, play it at some point during their journey. The tanks for the second set of scenarios are okay, though they both lack gun depression, which results in them getting shot non-stop by everyone in some of the situations. I think an interesting thing for this one would be one of the tanks as a reward for a player who completes all of the advanced set of these things, like the Eagle 7. Not an amazing tank, but let people drive around in a tank they'll earn for completing the mode. It's not like they're gonna lose a ton of money by offering that tank either, as it's already free for veterans on North America more than once, and has been a reward for Twitch drops at least twice, and ultimately isn't that interesting of a tank that weren't buying it otherwise anyways. So, with all the general sort of issues that the situations have across the board, or scenarios I guess, let's actually take a look at how these situations play out. For most of the maps, they'll be judged through the following criteria. The route will be given a 1 out of 10 rating based on just how it looks. A 10 is something along the lines of, this is really as good as it can be, realistically. A 1 is, this is the worst they could possibly do, and it will probably get you killed. The route players drive from point A to point B, each of these little arrows down here, will be worth 1 point. If it's a good route, it will add a point. If it's a bad route, it will be -1 point. A bad route is basically not a great place to drive, or a dangerous place to drive, or alternatively just like you could very easily just not do that and be better off. The positions players are told to stop at are worth 2 points in 2 different ways. If it's a good position of players to sit in, it'll be worth 2 points, whether it's like safe or you have shots there or whatever. If it's a bad one, it'll be -2. Any bad position that can very easily be avoided is worth double. So it'd be -4 points if you very easily could have a great position from a bad one. Every normal enemy spotted is worth 1 point, so like if you poke a corner and boom, there's a guy. Every extremely unrealistic target spotted is -1. For example, this is real. You'll see later. All of these points being rewarded or deducted is all up to my discretion here. Your point totals will likely be different to mine, though I'd like to think at least vaguely similar. I've been very generous with these scenarios, as it is not possible for Wargaming to teach someone how to play the game like this, nor is it possible to properly simulate how a battle will actually play out if tanks do not move. So, with all of that out of the way, let's see how some of the maps scored. We'll start with Steps, which is actually one of the maps that generally felt okay, especially considering I did not have a lot of faith going into it as to how it would go. The heavy tank's flank overview picture didn't really give me a lot of confidence either, as going out here in a heavy tank is not a great idea for either side. It's largely a very simple thing to counter, unless you don't have tanks on this flank to match what the enemy team has. The other side of the map went more or less as good as it really could go. This flank is notorious for getting shut down by people sitting at either side, so this isn't really something that can be accurately represented. Some of the tanks were unlikely to get spotted where the game made them show up, but to me anyway, was more important to know tanks can be there, rather than be picky about they would never get spotted there. Other tanks, however, were not even close. This Hetzer towards the south spawned out of render distance. Steps, overall, scored a 28, which isn't perfect, but it could be much, much, much worse. The heavy tank flank shouldn't send a person out to these rocks just ever, as there's this gigantic cross from either side. You're gonna get hit every single time. Like, if you don't get hit here, it's a rare thing, and you're probably in something like an IS-7 or a 50B for some reason that goes extremely fast. Alternatively, in a super heavy that just can't get penned, like a mouse or something. Otherwise, you are going to take damage every single time you try and cross this. Every single time, I guarantee it. As for the other side of the map, not so bad. It's pretty notorious for getting shut down, like I said earlier, so they did what they could to try and have that not happen for the most part. They even make people drive towards this part of the dip, which is the most in-cover spot on this entire flank for both sides, which is a good thing. The only thing I'd change, which really wouldn't affect anything else, is showing off light tank positions. There's only one light tank position actually shown to the player at any point during these scenarios, but they exist where you aren't going in every single scenario, so they're there, you just never see them. Small thing, but it does matter. Overall, these tutorials would get you killed anywhere from 5 to 7 times in real games, just because they don't address, like, don't do this if there's people here, don't do this there, but otherwise, you know, could be worse. Lakeville scenarios were in a similar boat, and it also kind of shows a huge flaw of the mode, at least one of them. Both heavy tank scenarios tell you to go valley, and the medium tank simulations, scenarios, whatever, you're going to hear that a lot, tell people to go to the city fight instead. This is where there could be multiple options, as heavy tanks can and do go both flanks all the time, which is also the case with medium tanks. Telling people to go valley in heavies or only go city in mediums and vice versa can be dangerous. You'll have people going valley in an OI and people going city in a Skoda T25. It just doesn't work. If we ignore that, these scenarios are very good, with one little exception near the end of most of them, but we'll get there. The positions and driving routes they take are very good across the board. They take very safe positions, which are at the fight, but not in the fight. They move place to place really as safe as you could possibly do it. I've regularly taken these exact routes in random battles before, for every single one of these scenarios. Lakeville scored a 55, which is very good. The only problem with these situations, outside of the few of the enemies getting spotted in ridiculous situations, which is normal, is the routes they tell you to take at the end. These are absolute death traps towards the end of the game, and people often bleed anywhere from half to all of their hit points just for driving across these. You can go here, but it's rarely a good idea. With those few exceptions, these are actually very accurate situations to what you'll use in real games, and the only time I can confidently say you'll get killed for doing this is at the end when they make you drive through the open. The rest of these are near perfect. Manorheim line was pretty similar to Steps in terms of I had very low expectations and was pleasantly surprised. The beginning of the first scenario really didn't give me confidence though. They start off by making you drive to this bunker. Literally, and I'm using the word properly here because so many people don't, including myself. Literally never go here in anything ever. There is zero situations where this is a good idea. Ever. Ever. Literally ever. Ever, 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 ever. I need to emphasize this as much as possible. I keep seeing it in real games. It has never gone well for anybody. You have no cover here. You get poked, hold down. If you back up, you get shot by tank destroyers. Never go here. Ever. Because it will not work. It never has worked. Probably in the past 9 years, it's never going to work. Unless you sacrifice 2 teammates right in front of you. And even then, probably still not going to work. If we exclude that, seeing some of this makes a lot of sense as to what I've seen in real games. I've seen people do this cross from the other spawn to the south spawn quite a lot. Now, obviously, they're not going to tell people to do the river cross because that's... You got to know a lot of like mechanical driving to get that done. So they're not going to tell brand new players how to do that because they're probably just going to drown if they try it. You can do it, but I wouldn't tell new players to do that. I don't really like this cross because I know how to do the other one. So fair enough. We can't really make it better because a new player is not going to know how to do that. So with those exceptions and really telling people to push into either base on Manorheim line really isn't a great idea. With those exceptions, the rest of this is mostly okay. The medium tank flank, however, is almost perfect. It's a little off, but it's real close. It's real close. Very little things, like telling people where to drive alternatively. They do that from the north spawn to the south spawn. They have you go down here instead of crossing the open, which is great. Like, that's fantastic. But they don't tell you to do that from the other side, which is what all of these rocks are for. Like, that's why this is designed like this, so you can actually slowly drop down instead of driving through the open. Otherwise, though, enemies get spotted in pretty realistic positions more or less every single time. Even a couple light tank positions are actually accurate to what they'd be in real games, so kudos for that too. But outside of that, I would say this scenario, collectively, I would say would get you killed probably 4 times or 5 times. And it's mostly, with one exception here, being this cross on the northern flank, just in the heavy tank scenarios. And that's also just because Manorheim line is such a nightmare to push. And for probably always will be, unless they get rid of A0. Manorheim line scored between Steps and Lakeville, which isn't a terrible place to be. So far it looks pretty good, right? All positive scores in the double digits. Like, it looks pretty good so far. Yeah, it is until we get to the maps that heavily stalemate, which is where these scenarios start to really step off the deep end in terms of telling the player what they can do. Let's start with Corellia first, just to warm you up for what you're about to see with the map after it. Corellia's situations overall are mostly fine until you get to what I would call like the mid-game stage of the scenario, where every single time they tell you to keep advancing. Now, for the sake of a tutorial, I understand you have to do this. However, every single one of these will get you killed if you try this. Now, in one of these scenarios, they actually teach you to take a route that won't get you shot as much, which kudos for that. I do that all the time. They don't do it for the other side, which is confusing. They also have the problem that I expressed with Lakeville, which was from the south spawn, medium tanks go north, but from the north spawn, heavy tanks go north. And vice versa the other way around. That's dangerous, right? If you're telling heavies and mediums to go fight on different flanks, that's dangerous. That is not a great concoction to, you know, stir up the pot a little bit. Imagine every single game if mediums only went down here and heavy tanks only went up here. I'm being over-exaggerating here a little bit, but again, this would not be great if this was how real games went. Corellia scored an 8 overall, and a large part of that really isn't the fault of these scenarios. It's just the fault of you can't push this, you can't push that, you really can't push this either, and even this is optimistic. So telling players to do it, I don't really know how to feel about that. Also, very unrealistic enemies getting spotted constantly. This light tank here is sitting in the one spot that there aren't any bushes in the middle of the map. This tank destroyer spawned out of render distance. Yes, really. This guy spawned out of render distance. It's the same story, unrealistic enemies, and a couple flanks that will get you killed. Overall, it scored an 8, like I said. This scenario would get you killed probably 8 times. 7 or 8 times, probably. Which is really kind of just a better gauge of how these things work than the point system. Because the lower the points, the more likely you are to just die, is what I'm realizing. Speaking of which, Brovka. Oh my god. So let me just preface this with, I died in 3 out of 4 of the scenarios, and almost died in the 4th scenario, and probably would have if I didn't blind kill some of the tanks to get through this, just for the sake of not having to do it again. I died in 3 of the 4 scenarios playing it the intended way. As someone who's done this a few times, that is ridiculous. I'm pretty sure as well, with a couple exceptions, almost every single enemy here was marked down as unrealistically getting spotted, because it doesn't matter if there's 87 bushes between you and them, they just spotted them anyway, and as soon as you shot them, you also got spotted. Making you poke a ridgeline on Prokhorovka to shoot tanks that are down in this dip, when tanks would never ever be down in this dip. Ever. The only time I'm ever in this dip is if their light tank's still alive and we're losing like 2 to 13. And I'm one of the last 2 people left because they managed to get to the corner. Otherwise, I'm never in this dip, pretty much ever. So they make you poke spots. You should never ever poke on Prokhorovka, ever, constantly. You have no gun depression. They did not code the bots to not shoot if they weren't activated yet, or if they weren't supposed to be part of this simulation. So if you poke anywhere, you just get shot to pieces. Now, partially that's more realistic to how the scenario should actually go, but also, if you're having new players do this, and I died 3 out of 4 times, and should have died the 4th time as well, oh my god, like, that's awful. Prokhorovka scored a -38. Yes, really. I think the best score any of the scenarios got was like -3. Like, I don't even know here, man. And in some fairness, you can't really make these that much better in some ways. Like, this route is a 1 out of 10. Like, 1 or 2 out of 10 for those two. Because if you try this, there is not a single Prokhorovka game where you will not get wiped off the map for trying this. At pretty much the final 2/3 of both of them. You will get wiped off the map every single time. Doesn't matter the tier. If you do this at tier 5 in like a Panzer 5-4, you will die every single time. I really guarantee it. Like, do not ever do this. And once again, I must emphasize, the next lowest score was 8. And Prokhorovka got a negative 38. Do you know how many times players would die in this scenario at different moments in real games? Because, again, every enemy here is a 2-shot, and you're like a 7 or 8 for them, at least. Imagine a battle where you're both like 5 or 6 shots for each other, or 7, or whatever it is. Imagine a game where you're both 7 shots away from killing each other. How many times do you think that person would die trying to do this in a real game? This scenario is so damaging and does not work in real games. So hard to the point where I don't even see people attempt this in real games. I see people go to the bunker on Manorheim line, for better or worse. Usually it's for worse because they never do well. Like, I at least see people go there. I have never, ever, ever seen a player do this in my life. And if I did, they didn't stay there for very long. So yeah, negative 38. And very small things could be improved about this. I also understand that you don't want players to just sit there for 10 minutes. What might be interesting is having a light tank come from the enemy spawn slowly. Like, have an allied light tank and an allied tank destroyer. Tank destroyer doesn't even need to shoot, it just has to be there. And have a light tank sit in a bush and then wait. And then after like 30 seconds of waiting, an enemy light tank gets spotted and the tank destroyer kills it. And then after that, the light tank can go down the bush line slowly and a target will get spotted. You have the player shoot it, target will get spotted, have a player shoot it, target will get spotted, have a player shoot it. And then once it gets to the end, it turns, drives into the open, and blows up because it, you know, spots a tank destroyer sitting on the rails. And then the player gets to shoot that, kill that as well. So now the whole bush line's clear, and now it's safe to, you know, go around and do all that stuff. From that point on, you can have enemies remain spotted the whole time because it doesn't really matter at that point. But if you're doing anything but something that drastic, this is horrible. Nearly every single enemy is unrealistically getting spotted, and this scenario would easily get you killed more than like 12 times. Easily would get you killed more than 12 times. So the other thing is, after playing a fair number of these, I already didn't want to continue with this, I'm gonna be honest. It was boring, it was monotonous, it was very repetitive, and for me, as someone who's done this a couple times, kind of annoying to see how glaringly wrong some of these situations are. Emphasizing for, you know, it was that bad. To put it simply, caring about these scenarios is mentally exhausting. It is just like the same thing over and over again, and I see partially why no one's even looked at this in 2 years, outside of the fact that there's really nothing here anyway. So for the sake of avoiding burnout, again, and, you know, to actually upload a video for once that isn't just saying, hey, I'm not dead, I decided to generalize the remaining scenarios. For all the other maps, I figured it would be a better system of measurement if I just mentioned how many times it would realistically get someone killed if they followed it verbatim. If you did what it told you to do. I'll also just mention how generally good or bad it was without keeping a score for it, because keeping score has become such a pain. Like, mentally, it's just become such a challenge to care. Mine's overall is alright, but it shows they need more of these scenarios for other classes. They aren't really bad routes, but they fail to point out how most of these maneuvers you do are either very early or very, very late game tactics. And also very rarely is crossing something like this a good idea in the middle of a match or even right after it starts. If you don't get there immediately, don't even try. They also never address the hill, ever. Not even once. Like, you as a player never go on the hill once, which is crazy to me, because where are all the bots coded to drive down at tier 1 to 5 games? Pretty much. El Haluf is in a similar boat. Most of it's good, but parts of it are very bad in very small ways, admittedly. This crossing should only be attempted by heavies that are kind of a lot faster than a Tiger 1. Other small route changes like this down here would be good, as taking this route instead is just asking to get shot at, versus just driving straight down the hill. That's why this little ledge is here. You could also, and I say this only because it's the actual speedrunning strategy, blind fire every single tank on the entirety of the map outside of like 3 to 4 tanks, because I've done that before. I wish I was kidding. Sand River gets big brownie points from me for telling players not to go into the riverbed at any point during this entire thing. The routes are pretty accurate and can't really be safer than they currently are. Steps is another one of those maps that's notoriously locked down from pretty much everywhere from mostly 3 positions. So this is fairly good for what it is. Although I will reiterate the value of putting multiple scenarios for each of these types, as well as scenarios for the other types, which would be invaluable on a map like Sand River, where specifically light tanks and tank destroyers can shine very well if they are given the opportunity to. Alanovka's big sin is the same as many other maps. People getting spotted when they shouldn't get spotted, and also the 3-minute drive to the hill is probably the most realistic part of this entire thing, but ignoring that. A very simple way to avoid getting shot by enemies would be nice, as opposed to what they tell you to do, which is just go straight down the hill. Kudos for telling players they can do these crosses, but again, multiple scenarios from this stuff would be nice, just to tell them, hey, this goes both ways, and it's actually probably better going the other ways. Province's simple problem is giving players a hope in the universe that this counter push will ever work. Ever. From either spawn. The only time I've ever seen this come even close to working is with triple light tank platoons, because you can do that down to tier 6. Both of these scenarios will get you killed every single time at multiple points. I guarantee you. Do not do these. Wide Park is already a dumpster fire, so I don't care, and you don't either. Also, Kazu died like 3 times when he tried this on his free-to-play account, so great tutorial, guys. And finally, Mountain Pass, which sucks so badly to the point where I don't even want to talk about it, but we're going to anyway. Bridge doesn't exist. Mid doesn't exist at all. Medium tanks go to the hold down flank, which is just great. Let's all agree this set of scenarios can't be worse than the map itself is, and that will also still hold true next patch as well, because oh my god, they're finally getting rid of the bushes, which is great. And then they put a rock there as hardcover. Good job, Wargaming. So in, well, the beginning to the conclusion, I guess, topography isn't actually the worst thing in the world, sort of. We still got, you know, world hunger and cancer. I'm being harsh for comedy's sake, of course, but even still. Some of these scenarios surprised me a lot. Like, a lot. I was very pleasantly surprised by Lakeville and Manorheim line. Both of them were very, very good. And not at all surprised by Prokhorovka. Not at all. Not in the slightest. I knew it was going to be horrible. Some of these are alright, though. Others are literally just assisted suicide. And some need small little route changes that would be very beneficial in the long run, specifically like El Haluf. As for the rewards, they're good for new players, but I think they could be a little better, and it's not just because everything should be free, but in very small ways it would be beneficial to them a lot. Things like demounting kits would really, really be worth it for them to go through all of these scenarios. Even if they didn't want to. Demounting kits save new players 10 gold, which they probably don't have much of in the first place, and letting them get them for free would probably really be a good incentive to get them to do this. And because, you know, knowing this game, they're gonna have Watt Plus shoved into their face at all hours of the day if they don't have it, because you can demount stuff for free for $9. So, yeah. And also, sort of knowing Wargaming, that tagline is gonna say, like, want to demount all the equipment you want or something. Like, it's gonna really be aggressive in terms of trying to get them to buy it, because they're gonna address a problem that they know new players have. It's not great pressuring new players, or players in general, but specifically new players, into a money spending commitment because they feel like they don't have much of a choice otherwise. I think the camo the bots use should be added as a reward for completing all the scenarios, because there's really no reason it shouldn't be, I guess. I can't really be the only one who thinks a crash test dummy skin would be funny on something like an IS-7 or something. Currently, the closest we have is the taxi camo. Shout out to Mara. And overall, I would say this idea is great, but the execution of it is a bit lackluster, which isn't anything really new with Wargaming's ideas here, if we're being honest. Nothing's perfect, but we could try to get as close as possible, right?